What's happening? Welcome to Everything Explained. I'm your host, Cory Wong. With me today is somebody I'm going to get into a little bit of discourse with. One of EV's engineers, Ethan Wetzell. The reason we're getting into some discourse is because there's a few phrases that people throw around a lot. I've used a lot through my life, and apparently I'm not using them technically the right way. And even as I try to define them up top in the way that I understand them, I'm going to tell that his body's going to be twitching, thinking that I'm going to do it wrong, and I'm going to ask for you to wait. We're going to each have our turn. This is not a political debate, by the way.
Not yet.
Not yet. It might. Yeah, it might become that way, yeah. Anyways, today we are talking about decibels, sound pressure levels, SPLs, loudness, all things that are actually different. In the real world, you know, we're gonna say some of these things interchangeably, and I'm not going to get pissed about it. He is.
I'm a lover, not a fighter.
I know, but it's that you respect the art form, like
100%.
Yes, yeah. You know, if we're in the key of B and you say G flat, I'm gonna be like, no, it's actually F sharp. It's actually F sharp. We're in the key of B. Like, it's G flat. It's like it's actually F sharp. So I get it. I'm here for it. I'm here to be corrected where I'm wrong. So my understanding from what I've learned from school and just my general being an engineer and things is that a decibel is something we typically use as a unit of measurement for how loud something is. Mm-hmm. It's actually a little more complex than that. There's actually multiple ways we can use these things. When I use the term loud, whatever, we'll get into that. So it's actually more like a mathematical ratio that can kind of define anything that's logarithmic, but it can be referenced to different things, like how loud we perceive something to be or whatnot. Mm-hmm. So a decibel is something that we in the music world refer to when we want more or less volume. And that does make sense, but in the technical world, it takes a little more to understand the real meaning. Sound pressure levels, SPL. These actually use decibels in their description. So they are very different because you actually need decibels to be able to talk about SPLs. Again, on a logarithmic scale, not linear. It's also not loudness, although most of us would probably just say loudness because what you hear and what the pressure is, these are different things.
They are.
I'm done. I'm gonna let you. I'm gonna let you take over from here, and I'm gonna observe.
We'll work through this together, Cory.
Thank you.
We'll get
Thank
there.
you.
All right.
Get me straight on this thing.
Absolutely. So, I mean, fundamentally, you're right. A decibel is a unit of measure, right? And one of the things that we as audio professionals are worried about, particularly in live sound, is how loud can I get something? You know, fundamentally, our job is to take you and make you louder. Now, objectively and quantifiably, the way that I can measure how loud I'm making you is through sound pressure level, or SPL. This is the measurable amount of pressure that the sound wave is creating as it leaves the speaker and it leaves the backline. And the unit of measure that we use to quantify that is a decibel.
Yeah.
Now, where it gets confusing is the decibel pops up in all sorts of bizarre places in our audio world. So I can use decibels to express what's going on and what's coming out of my speakers. I can use decibels to adjust what's going on inside of my mixing console. I can use decibels to figure out how much headroom I've got inside of my audio system. All of those are very different things, but they're all using the decibel. So fundamentally, a decibel is a unit of measure that is expressing a ratio of how much power it takes to produce that result. Clear as mud, right?
So how does that pertain to me as a musician? I'm on stage. I can't hear enough of my guitar. Can you please give me 4 SPL?
Well, yes. I mean, I'll give you 6 SPL if you want them. No, I mean, this is where a lot of confusion legitimately comes up in the industry. Totally. Because a decibel is, as I say, this common unit that gets thrown around and shows up in a lot of places. But the difference in the types of, or the context in which we use a decibel varies depending on what we're referencing. So in the example that you just used, where you are on stage and you want to hear more of yourself, that's going to be using...
Every musician can relate to that. Come on. More me. More me. Yeah.
So that's going to be using decibels as it relates to the minimum threshold of hearing for a human. So what winds up happening here is on the logarithmic scale, what will happen is every doubling of power, I am going to wind up picking up 3 dB in SPL.
Yes.
Power, okay? So what that means is acoustically, the difference between, say, 80 and 83 dB is going to be 3 dB. If I want to go to 86 dB, I need to double that. But if I want to go to 89 dB, I need to double it again. So even though I'm only moving in 3 dB increments here, I'm doubling and then quadrupling my power. This is where the logarithm comes in.
Yeah, it's not just linear. Add this much power, you're going to have this much decibel increase.
Or
SPL increase.
Or exponential, which is what we can find in feedback where something just takes off like a rocket.
Yeah.
This goes the other way, and it takes more and more and more to get that incremental increase, right? So that's where dB SPL comes in. But like I say, we see decibels pop up in all sorts of other places in our mixing console, and those have to do with what they're referenced to. So, for example, one that people hear a lot about is dBu. That's actually referenced to voltage, and that's specifically referenced to 0.775 volts on my mixing console. One of the big differences here, and again, because this is talking about ratios, if I'm talking about dB SPL, I'm not talking about negative values, right? I'm not going to have my sound pressure level be -6 because that would be below the threshold of human hearing.
Sure.
But when we're referencing voltage in something like dBu, which is referenced to 0.775 volts, or dBV, which is referenced to 1 volt, now I can have ratios that are below that. And that's what I'll get when I'm attenuating my signal. My unity gain would be at 0 dBu, for example. So this is where some of that confusion comes in, and this is why the decibel is both a very useful function, because I'm expressing that ratio to a reference level, but can also get a little confusing because sometimes people lose track of what exactly I'm referencing. Where this comes up a lot, and this is something that we touched on in our conversation about gain staging, is sometimes you'll get confusion between dBu, which is referenced again to 0.775, versus dBFS, which is referenced to my maximum allowable level in a digital scheme. So if I send...
Only digital?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, digital. DBFS stands for decibels full scale. So it's referenced to absolute full scale. If I go to +1 DBFS, bad things are going to wind up happening because my digital signal can't actually do that.
Yeah.
So this is one of the reasons that it's really important to understand those differences in terms, those differences in references. This is all a very roundabout way of saying a decibel is a way of expressing how loud something's going to get.
Sure.
Now, a very common misconception that we can run into in the pro audio world is people thinking that the important number when they're looking for a loudspeaker or looking for a PA system is actually watts. And that's just not the case. Watts are the power that I'm going to feed into a system to achieve a certain SPL. And that's a little bit like saying, you know, I'm going to give you 5 gallons of gas. How far can you go with it? I need to know what kind of car I'm driving. I need to know what I'm towing. I need to know how many people are there. Am I going uphill? On and on and on and on. So wattage is useful, but it doesn't actually tell me anything about how loud a PA is going to get. To understand that, I need to understand something called sensitivity, which is how much power I need to provide to a system to actually get to a certain level. And the way we measure that is we will take a loudspeaker, we will place a microphone at 1 meter away from the loudspeaker, and we will provide it with 1 watt of power, which is a lot louder than you might think it is.
Sure.
Why this is important is if I have again, a loudspeaker that has a higher sensitivity. So let's say I've got one loudspeaker that's got a sensitivity of 100 dB and another loudspeaker that's got a sensitivity of 106 dB.
Yeah.
Right? So if I feed that the same 1 watt of power, one's going to give me 100 dB SPL, one's going to give me 106 dB SPL. How much power will I need to feed to the 100 dB speaker to get the same output as the second?
4 watts, because you're going to need 4 times the power to get 106.
Exactly right. So what this means is that higher sensitivity speaker is going to be more efficient.
Yeah.
It's going to consume less power. It's going to be greener. It's going to be easier to run off of that dodgy hotel room power circuit that you're setting up in. All across the board, what you really want to pay attention to when you're looking at choosing a loudspeaker is what the maximum SPL that loudspeaker can achieve, not the wattage.
Okay, so a lot of times tube amps, let's say I have a 50-watt tube amp. I run it through a bunch of different speakers. It's cleaner, it's dirtier, it's louder, it's quieter. I see this all the time, which is why I ended up swapping out a ton of different guitar speakers, because I like to have the clean thing happening.
Yeah.
So the speaker definitely matters a lot more than I first thought. Where originally it was just like, oh, how many watts is the amp? That's how clean my guitar tone is going to be. The speaker actually played a huge role in it too.
Well, and this gets into a lot of the nuance about SPL, which again is an objective, quantifiable, measurable thing, versus loudness, which is a much more complex, arguably more subjective thing. And it gets into a lot of different things that go on in our brains and our ears as human beings, and a lot of things that can happen in the acoustic world with some of the things that come across it. We could talk about that a little bit more, but I think something that might be really useful is just to understand what some of these differences sound like in the real world.
Let's hear it.
As we're applying some more of this level. So what I'm going to play here, and for everybody listening at home, the level that you're listening to this on your speakers doesn't matter. The important thing to pay attention to is the difference between these levels as I switch between them. So what I'm going to start out with here is just a pure tone sine wave. Isn't that exciting? This is going to be a baseline level. Now, what I'm going to do is increase this by 3 dB.
Okay.
And listen for how much this changes. Again, I am doubling the power to get here.
A little bit of a difference, yeah. I mean, from here, not a huge...
Yeah. 3 dB is generally about the minimum change that a human can detect.
Okay.
So, again, that's our baseline. That's 3 dB. Now, if I go up to 6 dB, which most people will perceive as a substantial change, I can bump that up. That's a little more noticeable, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And then I can finally go to 10 dB, which most people will perceive as a doubling of SPL.
So that, to the human ear, feels like a doubling of...
Right.
At that frequency.
At that frequency. And this is where things get really interesting. So I'm going to do exactly the same thing, but instead of listening to just this pure tone, I'm going to add more acoustic information to it. I'm going to switch over to pink noise.
Everybody's favorite pink noise.
Everybody loves pink noise. So again, this is our baseline. That's
3
3 dB.
Yeah.
Baseline, 6 dB. Baseline, 10 dB. Now, what's really interesting here, that difference between 3 dB on the noise versus the pure tone.
You hear bigger difference in the white noise, or in the pink noise.
Exactly.
Just because there's more information?
Well, it gets into the weirdness of how our ears work. So the human ear is not linear.
Yeah.
We are much, much more sensitive to upper mids somewhere between about 1 kilohertz and 4 kilohertz, which just so happens to be about the vocal center of human speech. So we have evolved to have our ears be very, very tuned in to that range so we can communicate with each other. We're much less sensitive to very low frequencies. We're much less sensitive to very high frequencies.
Yeah.
But where it also gets really strange is as the SPL increases, that nonlinearity will vary. This gets into something called an equal loudness curve, which is very important not only for live sound professionals, but anybody who's doing production to understand our ears will hear different things in different ways at different levels.
Yeah.
So,
which is why sometimes you mix at quieter levels. Does your mix work when it's quiet?
Exactly.
You turn your mix up loud, and sometimes it's like, oh man, this mix is slant. It's amazing when I have it cranked, and then I turn it way down. It's like, oh, it's not as good.
Or vice versa. You know, you could be mixing at a very low level, get your bass dialed in, especially, you know, the sub bass and the 808 and everything else, and then you bump it up to club levels and your face is melting from all of the additional buildup. It's because as you increase those levels, that sensitivity begins to normalize a little bit more. So we are not sensitive the same way to all frequencies at high SPLs as we are at low SPLs. This gets into, like I say, both the equal loudness curves, the Fletcher-Munson curves that I'm sure producers and live sound folks out there have heard about before, but it's also a really important characteristic.
Love his first record. Yeah.
Isn't that great?
Yeah.
It's also really important. It's also really important when we're talking about how do we measure SPL. So there are things that we refer to as weighting, which are essentially just filters that we apply to a sound pressure level meter to more accurately match the human ear. So what's referred to as Z weighting is unfiltered, completely flat. What's referred to as A weighting has less sensitivity to very low and very high frequencies. So that more approximates how the human ear works at lower levels. C weighting, it approximates higher SPL, so it's more sensitive to lower and higher frequencies. Great, that's fascinating, that's really academic, right? But where this becomes really important to understand in the live sound world especially is if you're dealing with things like SPL limitations. And somebody comes up to you and says, you can't get louder than 90 dB.
Yo, man, I remember growing up, I was at this church for a while. Mm-hmm. These cats would be out there in the pews with their iPhones with these decibel meters.
Yeah.
It's too loud to them, so they just hold it up back at the cat at the soundboard. It's like, yo, leave this dude alone. He's up there just trying to do his thing.
That's right. Yeah. And so when somebody comes up to you and says, I need you to hit an SPL limit of whatever, you need to ask them, more information.
Yeah.
Is that unweighted, A-weighted, C-weighted? Is that short-term, so I'm catching all of my peaks? Or is that long-term, where I'm averaging everything out? Because one really interesting characteristic of live audio...
I can just see... I was actually just at a festival in Asia where they told us... Miles, my sound engineer, comes up, he's like, man, they told me there's a decibel limit, so just want to give you a heads up. It's not going to quite feel the exact same. It's going to be a little different, blah, blah, blah. They have a decibel limit of whatever. I would love for him to just have gone back to this promoter and just be like, well, do you mean 92 dB in blah, 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 blah. Well, what would they have done? They'd just been like, I don't, just like, don't make it that loud. Just like have it kind of like, I don't know. I don't know, a curve, just like, well, I mean, could he have used some of these terms and just shown them a meter and be like, look, it's 92. No, I'm not going over.
I'll give you a real world example.
I totally interrupted you.
No. I'll give you a real world example of where this has actually come up. I was working a festival one time, and we had the SPL police show up. They're at the property bound and say you're too loud. You need to turn down. Our limit is 85 dB.
Yeah.
So I pulled out my sound level meter. Took a measurement of the squad car that was idling, and guess what? The squad car was louder than the SPL that he was trying to enforce on us. So
he's like, car's louder, huh? Well, why don't you see how loud it is in the back seat, all right? Let's go.
And we were very nice about it. You know, the guy was really cool. He understood. You know, it was one of those "don't shoot the messenger" kind of moments.
Yeah.
But I mean, this is a place where nuance actually counts.
Yeah.
Where are you measuring? How are you measuring? And what are the details? You know, and this is where some of the bizarre nuances of things like SPL that seems incredibly straightforward can become really, really convoluted and confusing.
I don't know that anything was actually cleared up in this video for me, but I do feel like I did gain something at the end of the day. Well, definitely one thing that I was glad to have confirmed here is pulling up 6 dB in low frequencies and high frequencies, the human ear perceives it differently. And I'm glad to hear that representation here because it's different. And it's different in different systems. It's different in different frequencies, different instruments, how much harmonic information is happening.
Well, and what we're adjusting. And this is why I say that SPL is quantifiable, objective, and measurable, but loudness is very subjective. Because as we add that harmonic information, you know, as we are adjusting certain frequencies with how the human ear works, our perception of loudness can change even though the SPL stays exactly the same. Where you see this beginning to pop up a lot in the loudness wars, for example, is people, you know, slamming something into brick wall compression and then throwing a distressor or a clipper at the back end to add that additional harmonic information to get it louder. The SPL doesn't change, but what winds up happening is you perceive it as louder, but you also are getting more ear fatigue.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not going to call out any albums that are out there, but we all suffered through the loudness wars, and some of those things are just head darts of harmonics and hash in the high end to just try to get it louder.
Yeah.
So understanding how all of that works is really important. And it's also important to understand that making a 3 dB adjustment to my broadband signal at a concert is, you know, as we just showed, barely perceptible. But if I'm adjusting, say, your guitar or your vocal by 3 dB in the mix, just bringing up that one section and that one slice of acoustic information can make a big difference.
Yeah.
You know, if you're trying to fight feedback, notching something out by 1 or 2 dB can make all the difference in the world. So even though we're dealing with these very interesting and small adjustments in broadband, they can have a really big impact on a broader system as you're doing mixing or as you're setting up a PA. And that applies to both live sound and studio.
I don't even know how to end this. I hope you got something out of it. I did. I like this. I do have more questions that I'm going to ask off cam.
Absolutely.
But I would suggest if this also maybe sparked more interest in this whole topic, why don't you call your local college and get a degree in audio engineering? You know, we need more cats like you. We need some acoustical engineers out there because you're going to want to retire someday and somebody's going to have to replace you. So, well, no, really, this is fantastic information to get into. I love diving into the science of this because the musician perspective and the technical perspective, they're both valid, and we both use these terms sometimes in different ways and a lot of times the same way. Yeah. But we both understand we're trying to achieve the same thing. We can get into the nuance of it, but the reality is there's a lot of ways that you can dive into this, and hopefully it sparks some of your curiosity. I'm very curious. We're very curious about a lot of different topics, so we have a whole series, this Everything Explained, talking about different things. Ethan and many other engineers here at EV are happy to indulge my curiosities as we dive into some of these topics. So we'll see you next time. Peace.